Northern Ireland, a small step to a giant adventure. Book your next giant adventure at discovernorthernireland.com.
Welcome to the West Belfast Festival Féile and Phobail Breaking Down the Walls event. This is supported by the Executive Office. Really fascinating topic our panel are going to be discussing today, and that's peace walls, both the present and the future of peace walls in Belfast, but also Derry, Londonderry and Portadown as well. The majority of peace walls obviously in Belfast, but also in other places. We've got a fantastic panel today, and rather than me introduce them, I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And I'm going to start on the far side of the room. Anton, can you just introduce yourself, what work you do?
So, Robbie, I'm Anton Higney. I'm from the Divis area, Lower Falls, and I'm a youth and community worker. I've been born and bred the whole way through it, and I do a load of cross-community work.
And next, Trevor.
I'm Trevor Greer. I'm from South Belfast, and previously I was a member of a South and West Action Team for 3 years, working along the interface of Westlink and Broadway. I'm also a member of the Community Engagement Network, which works along the long stretch between Sandy Row up to Lisburn on interface issues.
And Katie.
I'm Katie Taylor. I work for the Department of Justice. I head up the Community Safety Division, so we look after a wide range of issues from domestic and sexual violence, our police and community safety partnerships through to our interface programme. So we have a small team of interface workers who would work with the community and elected representatives to achieve the ambition of reducing and removing the interface structures as part of the overall TBUC programme.
And I suppose you should say you're Dr. Katie Taylor, which distinguishes you from the boxer, obviously. And last but not least, Christina.
Hiya, I'm Tina Black and I'm manager Grosvenor Community Centre. I've been there for more years than I care to admit. The community centre runs parallel to the Westlink and an interface, so I've a long history of working with Trevor Greer and the community organisations right across the Falls. And from my perspective, the interfaces have changed, but it's mostly more about deprivation.
So fantastic panel today. I am going to slightly change the order of the questions. We have a number of topics that we want to discuss, but what I wanted to do first, for people who don't realise, I'm going to come to you first, Katie, because just give us the official perspective on peace walls. I know there was a strategy in the TBUC document, Together Building United Community document, back in 2013 to remove peace walls within a certain period. Now, we'll go on to discuss whether that's realistic or not, but give us the official position, I suppose, from the Department of Justice.
Sure, no problem. So I suppose our starting point for this work is that we work with communities at the point at which they're ready to do so to remove and reduce interface structures. And as you said, I think there's sometimes a bit of a perception that there isn't a strategy or a plan around how that would be taken forward. But as you say, the TBUC programme, when it was set up and back in 2013, sets out a pretty clear policy ambition, which is the removal or reduction of all interface structures by 2023. And as you said, I think we'll have an interesting conversation about sort of whether that's a realistic timescale or not. But I think you can't get a much clearer ambition or policy aspiration than that. So in terms of taking that forward, then regardless of whether the timescale is realistic, you obviously need to break that down into sort of more manageable pieces of work, and we would work to a work programme to start looking at what are the viable schemes and where can we start taking that forward. So we work to a number of principles, I suppose, community consent being one, taking account of the local context. We always say every interface is unique. Looking at what other work is being taken forward in an area, whether that's around social and economic deprivation or regeneration, taking account of that context, and looking at really where the community are at in terms of what is wanted and what is needed. So that's our starting point, and we work towards a programme of work. We get our funding from the overall TBUC programme to allow us to facilitate that. But I should say we're very much, and you'll probably hear me reiterate this throughout the conversation because I think it's an important point to make, that we are one player on a very complex landscape. And whilst we're responsible for the physical structures, that cannot be taken forward or really actioned in isolation from thinking about the broader context and all of our partners. So we have a work plan, but as I will continue to say, our starting point is where there's an appetite to do so. That work plan has to be flexible because we have to react and respond to what's happening on the ground, and move forward more quickly than anticipated if there's an appetite for that, or sometimes pull back slightly if trouble flares up and maybe confidence has been knocked slightly and the community just aren't quite ready to move forward with a scheme.
Okay, before just bringing our other panellists who represent many of those voices in the ground, I know that you poll regularly with attitudes towards peace walls, and in the most recent Ipsos Mori poll that was carried out for the Department of Justice, what was quite striking to me was that in overall community terms, there's a vast majority of people who want peace walls to go, but that's not the case, obviously, for people who live communities who live close to peace walls. What are the main reasons why people who live in and around peace walls on either side want them to stay? Why do they think they're valuable to an extent?
I mean, I think we'll tease some of that out today, and I'm not sure it's really for me to answer that question. If I'm completely honest, I think it's for the people who live closest to the structures to speak to that, and for us to take that on board and try and address.
What did the polling find?
The polling, I mean, as I said, it's a really complicated landscape when it comes to interface structures. There are obviously the security concerns, and I think that those ebb and flow depending on recent events at an interface structure. So you might see us making really good progress in an area, and then so a North Queen Street, for example, and then recent trouble can sort of damage that confidence. But I think there's also the conversation that we need to have around the wider regeneration of a particular area and what benefits the community see or don't see from the structure being removed. And one of the things that we try to do to address that is when we're talking to communities, we would use like visualization or case studies from structures that have been removed to try and talk to the community about what could the benefits be of removing this. Because I imagine it's quite easy to default to it's always been here or it's been here for a long time, and it provides a sense of security, so why would we take it away? And I think we need to just challenge that a little bit and start to think about, well, what are the opportunities that come with removal?
Okay, I think that's a good point, thanks Kitty, to actually bring in our other panellists to get an impression of what it's like for people living on the ground towards peace. Well, so I'm going to start with you, Christina. You're closest to me. What are the issues or concerns that residents have? I know you talk to a lot of them who live close to peace walls. What are the important things for them when it comes to a discussion around peace walls and whether they should be there or not?
Okay, Robbie, I think the mistake that we've made thus far historically has been to look at this in a very narrow perspective instead of taking in the whole surrounding area of most interfaces. And most of the research suggests that interface localities are areas of deprivation, so you have social, economic, health problems. In terms of the interface removal, it's not as simple as taking a wall down and hoping that we can all hold hands and peace will be a given. You need to look at those sites even in urban terms. So interface localities, where the interface is located, is generally surrounded by derelict urban landscapes that are pretty useless to people. So firstly, people aren't using those sites. If they are, generally it's going to be for something negative because the sites aren't illuminated, they're not safe, they're not attractive in some instances, although there has been a lot of positive work done. So when people are asked a straightforward question, do you want an interface to come away? To me, their primary concern is safety. So 9 times out of 10, the answer, if you live near there, is likely to be a no, because you're going to say, well, why would I want this interface removed if it's going to cause me additional hassle? The follow-up to that question should be then, well, if we could offer you, as Katie referenced, this is what it could look like, this is what it could mean. It would be better connectivity in Belfast, better cycle routes, better walking, but people have yet to be offered those alternatives in any viable way thus far. So, and I think that's the way forward. And so I don't think that people don't want to come together. That's not the issue. It's just that they think of their families and safety and their life and the routes to school and parking and urban planning issues. It's more about those that we need to remedy before people can even look at having these interfaces removed.
So do you think then the focus on peace walls is in and of themselves is misguided?
I do, to some extent. Now, changes in certain times, like the events at Easter, I think put us back a few years, and it maybe reframed people's minds back on the interfaces themselves. But generally, you give that a few months and it moves away again. I'll use Distillery Street as an example. The Distillery Street interface, it runs parallel to the West Link. So that wall effectively keeps Grosvenor Estate away from the West Link. So you have road safety issues there initially, but it also cocoons the area in not a positive way from the rest of the city. So I think when people sort of open up, are given the tools to visualise what that site could be, they would be much more inclined to want to see that interface going.
You know, Trevor, that you obviously have worked on interfaces in Belfast. You would work regularly across the community, but obviously you know loyalist areas particularly well. What's the view of peace walls in loyalist areas?
Well, the area where I work, which would be South Belfast, we're lucky enough not to have many peace walls because they're all roads. There's plenty of interfaces, plenty of flashpoints, but there's no walls. In fact, the only wall I think that we would have would be at Grosvenor. But if I asked, if I actually, or anybody went out to ask the people who live in, say, the bottom of Roden Street there on the south side, could we open that gate at the Grosvenor, or could we take that fence down or the wall down at the Grosvenor? I would say the answer you would get from both sides of the community would be no, because the simple fact is they are the ones that have to suffer if there is interface violence. Now, the people that live at the bottom of Roden Street, they're not the people that are throwing stones into the Grosvenor Estate. The people that live in Distillery Way aren't the people that are throwing stones into Roden Street. These are people coming in from other areas to do this. So until we get that sorted out, I can't see peace walls going anywhere, especially if you're talking about the likes of Cooper Street and stuff like that. I don't think there's a cat in hell's chance of getting peace walls brought down, and certainly not by the date that was mentioned, which was 2023.
So, big question. I know you've probably worked in this a lot. You know, given you're saying it's people from elsewhere who use the peace wall then as a chance to give hassle to the other community, how can you go about stopping that? Because obviously you can't stop freedom of movement, I suppose.
No, but it's education. It's education about sectarianism, about the need to stop violence. We've all. I would be the first one to one of the ways that I said it, because people used to say to me years ago, young people, Vada went to them and spoke to them about violence at Roden Street and that there. They said, "But you done it." My answer to them was, there was nobody telling me not to. The difference is, I'm asking you not to. What I started doing was trying to get funding, and it wasn't through the normal places like Department of Justice or Belfast City Council. I started working with Active Communities Network up in the White Rock, Jim Donnelly, and one time there was a bit of trouble at the Roden Street area, and I got the lads together. They wanted to go away for a 2-day thing. I think it was Todd's Leap or something. So I went to them and spoke to them. I says, "But we've a problem." I said, "What's the problem?" I says, "It's where I'm getting the money from." I says, "You're causing trouble for that community across the way." He says, "Where are you getting the money from?" I says, "West Belfast." I said, "Oh, it's all right, we'll stop." It worked. Now, the thing is, that was only one group. Later on, another wee group starts, another wee group. It's getting that stopped is the hard thing. And with the way kids are nowadays, everywhere you go, kids are meeting in big groups, whether it be parks, things. So if there's any tensions anywhere, an interface always seems good for them. Another thing we probably need is better politics in Northern Ireland. Because if politics was working in Northern Ireland, you'd probably get less hassle all round. But at the minute, politics aren't working.
Anton, I'm going to come on to you because one of the things, don't want to pin young people for this, obviously, but it does tend to be young people that mostly get attracted to trouble around peace walls. I know you work with young people. How do you go about trying to stop them getting involved in interface conflict?
Well, for me, it's about providing life opportunities. At the end of the day, Tina's spot on once you say is poverty. You know, it's about providing the opportunities to broaden our horizons, whether that's through learning, informal learning or education ways, OCNs or the likes of TBUC and the likes of NCS, where young people are coming together cross-community and we're not restricting them. See, what I hate is the likes of community groups and youth groups that will tell young people, right, you can't bring this top, you can't say this, you can't say that. No, we need to have them conversations. We need to lay them down on the floor. What's the difference here and how do we separate it? You know, what Trevor said, realistically, we're going to be doing this for years. I've worked with a group of young people and then the next year it's a different group of young people following on, different. It's about breaking down the me. We still have our post-conflict society. Part of it, it's the intergenerational trauma that filters down. It's the values and beliefs that the young people are getting from their peers, their community and their family. You know, it's the likes of a wee 6-year-old up in Cooper Street looking at that big tall wall and saying, well, this keeps me safe. It's that factor that they know it keeps them safe, where realistically it segregates our whole entire city. It keeps people apart, and not only it keeps people apart, the young people suffer. And I don't see it. Now, we are in the modern day technology and stuff like that, where young people do have social media. Like Trevor says, if there's trouble in an interface area, they will go there within 15 minutes and you're talking a group of 25 to 30 young people. Now, majority of the time, once we're on the actual ground working, we're pulling our young people away because we have that relationship with them. It's the ones from the outside of the community. You know, you're trying to tell them to pull off or come away. You know, you don't want to get a criminal record. We don't want your life to be, you know, ruined over something so silly. But because you don't have that rapport with them, they'll just tell you to do one and then just walk on and keep riding. And yes, at the same time, do I believe community workers and youth workers should be up in interface areas? We need to come together and stand up as a group. Like you said, better politics, you know, it starts off from the ground, grassroots. People show, you lead from example. That's what I've been told my whole life. And it's about encouraging that with the young people. It's about telling them, yes, there is more life opportunities out there. You just don't need to go up to an interface area to ride.
What's actually really fascinating to me is you actually mentioned even 6-year-olds talking about peace walls and the reasons for being there. Because I'm thinking, I haven't heard too many young people actually talk about peace walls. Maybe that's because we haven't listened to them enough. But is it something that young people would regularly talk about, whether peace walls should be there or not, or their view of peace walls?
I mean, it is a sad reality, but they just see it as normality. You know, it's a part of their life. It's always been there. You know, likelihood of it will be there until after they're gone. So, you know, it's normal, which isn't, you know, if you go over to the likes of the United Kingdom, England, Scotland, Wales, there's no town that segregates the city. You know, so why, yes, obviously, because of the troubles, the direct impact, no one understands the values and beliefs that young people are installing in themselves at an early age. You know, we talk about, even at it, you know, we're talking about a peace wall. Our education system segregated. I think that's one of the core issues as well. It's about bringing the two groups together, from elderly people, residents, right down to young people, and having that conversation, because we are all the same at the end of the day. It's literally just where we were born.
I mean, just finally on this section to you, Christine. I mean, it's just because Trevor has mentioned it. I mean, obviously, he thinks, you know, 2023 is not realistic in any way, shape, or form. You know, first of all, would you share that view? And also, do you think it's helpful to put, although it's an ambition, do you think it's helpful to actually put a time scale in the removal of peace wall?
I would agree with Trevor. I think that it's unrealistic, but considering the timing of when that date was arrived at, maybe at that point it didn't seem unrealistic. So I think that, Robbie, the viable alternatives aren't there yet. So you can't expect people to take that leap into the unknown we're going to remove this wall, but we're going to leave a vacant, derelict site that your children can't play on, that's adjacent to a road that has really bad air quality, but we're not going to offer you anything else. Obviously, they're going to say, no, we'll stick with the status quo. But I do think that we need to have some aims as well. Although, harking back to what Katie said, every interface is totally different. And I think that's maybe where we've made mistakes previously. Literally in the physical landscape of each interface, they're totally different. Some are right in the middle of, I'll say, Percy Street, running the back of a street, literally houses on either side. Roden Street interface is intersected by the Westlink motorway. So it's totally different to Percy Street. The irony is, I remember when Roden Street interface was opened, and it was open the whole way through the 90s when the conflict was at its worst, and it's closed now. But it is more for road safety issues than for issues at the interface. So I think it's useful to have aims and aspirations, but it needs to be very individualistic. And I think that some agencies need to sort of apportion a budget, and maybe you could have feasibility studies for each individual site to reflect the needs of that area. And particularly from my own perspective, I think our biggest challenge is the interfaces that inner city surrounding communities have from the inner city, because I feel more separate from the city centre and city core than I do from South Belfast in poverty terms, where we're deprived areas around the city core are not feeling the benefits yet of the economic regeneration of the city centre.
So, Katie, at some point, obviously, the T-Buck aspiration will have to be looked at. You know, I think realistically it's not going to be fulfilled. But do you think it is helpful if we are going down the line to set a time scale in these things in future? Or is that something that, having done once, the executive won't be keen to do again, given, as Christina and Trevor and Antoine have said, the individual circumstances of each piece will?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think, you know, what Tina has said about you need to have an ambition and an aspiration. And, you know, there's a quote that goes something like, every accomplishment starts with a decision to try, you know, and I think something about setting a framework around what is it we're trying to achieve and where we're trying to get to is important. Personally, I'm not sure having a time frame is helpful, actually. Potentially puts an artificial structure around a very complicated issue and maybe makes some assumptions about this being a process. And we always say, you know, removing an interface is a journey, it's not an event. There are very, very few sort of Berlin Wall moments, if you want. You know, it is an iterative process, and it's about building confidence where you can, in line with where the community are ready to get to. So I think putting a time frame around that maybe gives the impression that this is something that we will be doing no matter what people on the ground think or how they feel about it. And this is about the physical structures from our perspective, but it's ultimately about people's lives and about the people who are living in the shadow of those structures. So I suppose my personal view is I'm yet to be convinced that a time frame is the way to go. I do think you need a very clear ambition and setting out how you would achieve that. I think that T-Buck is a very good start in that regard. We have our own, as I said, our own framework document which sets out our own principles around how we would do that. And we do treat each interface as a unique project, as it were, for want of a better word. Certainly, like any strategy, I think the executive will review T-Buck. It comes to a natural point in time, and the executive will want to review that and consider what the options are around that. We're one of 7 what are called headline actions within T-Buck, so that sits alongside all of the issues that Anton has raised there around shared housing, shared education, you know, summer camps, good relations programs. All of that has to be addressed in tandem. So I think it's looking at what is the aspiration of T-Buck long term as opposed to just what is the aspiration of the interface programme, because you can't separate the two, because without those building blocks that you've described, and I think you hit the nail on the head with sort of describing what is it that we need to address from the ground up in order to get the right conditions for removal. All of that has to be done in tandem. So of course, like any government strategy, you will put some parameters around that and you will have review points, and you will want to make sure that the pace and the drive and the ambition doesn't diminish. But I'm not sure we're ready yet to be saying that all structures would be removed by a certain date. But the ambition should remain.
I suppose one of the things that, let's move away from the negative. Okay, we realise 2023 isn't going to happen in terms of all peace walls, but we shouldn't forget there have been, I suppose, some positive developments. I mean, I can remember when Lanark Way Gate was always closed effectively. Now we know that people can go from the Springfield to Shankill and back and forth, for most of the day anyway. And there have been other developments as well. Let's, I suppose, move towards the positive and the ambition. Trevor, what kind of, and obviously it will have to be in individual circumstances, but what kind of needs to happen, or what would be the right conditions or the right developments for individual walls or barriers to come down, or at least with something like Lanark Way where you have gates that are open between community for a longer period? What positive things actually happen to enable something like that to take place?
In Northern Ireland, in my opinion, it's getting back to government, and it has to be good government. It has to be government that can work together. Until the trust between political parties is there, the trust will not trickle down the interface communities. Now, as I say, when I'm going to say interface communities, it's not as if, as I've said it before, that the people from the Grosvenor don't trust the people from Roden Street. It's not them that are the issue. It's other people. It's other people causing the problems, not from the area. I've never lived on an interface. I've worked very close to interface areas and that there, but I think it's gonna be very, very difficult. I don't want to be negative about everything, but it's just the fact that the way Stormont is, it just doesn't give you too much hope for any change, because until people on the ground and local people can see things happening up higher, they're not aspire to anything else.
So what do local people on the ground want to see, though? Is it regeneration? Is it new facilities in their areas? Is that what they want? Or is it, as you say, the higher public messaging, if you like, politicians to be seen to be cooperating more? I
would say a lot of it would be politicians doing what it is they're paid to do. A lot of interface areas, most of the thing that you would hear within the interface areas that I would know is social housing. They want social housing. There's no use knocking down walls and building 300 apartments that the local people are, one, not going to be able to afford, or other people from outside the area are going to be moving in. It's not what they want into this land that's always sitting about interface areas. We need good government, and we need good housing for local people as well. And I'm not saying that it has to be all local people. It can be a mix, but you can't just throw new apartments up here, there and everywhere at interface areas and hope that it's going to be, well, what it would end up is it's a buffer lane. And that's all it would be. You'd be knocking down a wall to build a set of apartments that nobody knows who's in the apartments, and it would end up being a new wall. Only it would be a buffer lane between the both communities.
I'm going to come to you after I talk to Anton, Christina, because you are a politician. And I think I'd like to get your answer on some of the things Trevor has posed. So Anton, I'm going to come to you now. I mean, Trevor has mentioned things like social housing, for instance, that would be a way of, I suppose, we're kind of reassuring a community or helping a community kind of inch forward, if you like, and the importance of that to a community. But is that something really young people think about as a way of, in the end, getting rid of interfaces? Or what, in terms of the young people you talk to who at the minute see the peace wall as their normality, what kind of things would influence them perhaps to kind of change or see a way when towards a peace wall going?
Play parks aren't a thing. Freezy pitches, yes, they're all round, but at the same time, there's no skate parks. The closest skate park to here would be the bottom of the town beside the Big Fish. You know, it's a troop down for the young people. It's just about providing that space for them to chill, where they know that they can go to and they're not getting hassled by anyone, and they know that they're not hassling any residents close by and stuff like that. But, you know, it comes to that false consciousness. You know, it's the young people having that in the back of their head that it's security and it's safe. It's about trying to have a conversation about removing it, because at the end of the day, they are on social media talking to people from the other side and vice versa, backwards. It's not like there's a gap there. It's not like they're isolated completely from each other, you know. So we are winning. It's just, I think it's because obviously they're getting it from their grannies, grandads, their mummies and daddies, that the wall is a significant part of their life, you know. And it's just about trying to address that. But in terms of housing, they don't see it. They don't even see that their own educational needs are low. All they see is they hate school. That they don't, it's not for them, there's no learning stays. I do believe it's the segregation between the whole entire thing. It's between the two communities, it's between the education, and it's poverty at the end of the day. It's about providing them with the resources. It's about getting them up and getting them vocal. You know, we all have a voice, we all have a mouth. We need to use it. But I believe time frame ways, yes, politicians coming together would help support it, because, you know, the young people are seeing the likes of the DUP and the Sinn Féin fighting amongst each other constantly, and they don't understand it. They just see Catholic and Protestant, nice one as loyalist, that, you know, and that's setting a precedence for our young people then to spread more hatred.
So Tina, you really need to sort that out.
Sorry, Tina.
No bother, Robbie. Well, from my perspective, I totally agree, Anton and Trevor. It's, as politicians, you should be leading by example. And I know it's a cliche, but that could mean within your own locality coming out against something that makes you wildly unpopular, but having the bravery to do it. If that means coming out against a bonfire that's causing antisocial issues or it's upsetting older residents. It also means admitting that I come from the Grosvenor estate. I would have a lot more in common with Trevor, coming from a working class, loyalist, unionist area, than I maybe would from someone who grew up in Malone. We may as well go to the standard reference point. So it's about admitting that we share a lot more than what divides us, making some choices that maybe aren't going to be vote winners, but taking a higher ground and saying, okay, if this means the end of your career in politics, so be it. If it's making your area a better place. Sound a bit like Andy. But in an ideal world, but in the bigger picture stuff, I think I'll use Belfast City Council as an example. The city centre is going to have the Weavers Cross Transport Hub soon enough. It's on the periphery. It started. The enabling works have finished. There should be a big onus on that in terms of social inclusion. That massive development for our city and the region should be trickling out to the areas around, a number of which are interface communities. And it can't be a donation of assistance towards a bus or a new football kit. It needs to be 100 young people going in at jobs at quite a high level. And even if it's jobs that are like railway engineers, well, we'll have about 6 years to get them prepped up to that level. So I think that the investment from companies needs to reflect the ambitions for the city. In terms of movement across the city, it really saddens me. When I was growing up, we would have did a lot of our shopping on Sandy Row. Again, at a time when maybe it wasn't perceived as safe, however, it always was. But the fact of the matter is now, there isn't a reason to go to shop in different areas because your local high street has been decimated by modern society and the roads to get there aren't that pleasant to walk along. So it isn't that people have gotten more sectarian. There's less of a reason to leave your part of the city. Firstly, if you're skint. And secondly, if there's nothing on offer in the other part of the city. Thirdly, if the road to get there is grim, why would you choose to go there? And I think that's all contributed to community inertia. And I think as well, as politicians, you need to realise your area's unique selling points and realise where your area's not so great, and realise where another area maybe deserves 5 years of, look, we need to focus on that community for 3 or 4 years because this community's advanced to a certain amount, and it could be different right across the city. It just depends. As Trevor said, your social housing, for instance, there's a big social housing waiting list in West Belfast, but the nature of the housing needs to reflect the demand. So it should be housing for families, big gardens, big communal areas that are safe and have something to offer. We need to reflect the environmental challenges faced in these communities too. I've mentioned the Westlink. Mulhouse Road has the worst air quality in the whole of Belfast. I actually get into a bit of a debate with someone recently about we're trying to redevelop Distillery Street with help from DOJ, and someone had said, well, if you're going to develop sites for children to play on that run parallel to the Westlink and the air quality's bad, so technically you're encouraging children to play beside somewhere that has air quality. And I just found this so laughable. They live there. So are we going to demolish these entire estates where there's communities have grown up? It's not our fault that the Westlink was plonked down the middle and sort of intersected the city. So in a nutshell, that was very cohesive. We need to be brave. You need to recognise where there's room for improvement and take the leap. We need to work together. I think as well, it's okay taking the peace lines down, but if there's no reason to walk over to South Belfast, people aren't going to go that way anyway. But if they attend the same school, they're more likely to do so. And I do agree with Anton about young people. I mean, Robbie, I have found the youth clubs in the area are working together cross-community terms. They don't call it cross-community, which is wonderful. In cultural terms, they're attending school with members of different cultural backgrounds, and it's just the norm. It's our generation that need to come forward. It's not actually the younger generation.
But one of the things I just want to push on a wee bit more, though, is that, look, I mean, I would watch a lot of stormont committees in education. It's part of my job. And what's quite impressive is the way that MLAs from different parties actually work together, on an issue. And I know that you would probably say as a city councillor, there's a lot more that politicians do together than separates them. There's a lot of work goes on the ground, perhaps. That's probably the case for all politicians. But what Trevor and Anton have both raised is that, let's face it, most people don't pay a lot of attention to Belfast City Council meetings. They don't pay a lot of attention to Stormont committees. They don't pay a lot of attention to politics in and out. So what really is important is the big picture messaging, because that, people only pick up a tiny amount of what politicians do. And at the top, it does seem that quite often it's division that gets emphasised. That Anton and Trevor have mentioned it. It seems that it's not just the UP and Sinn Féin, but politicians at the top level, it's division at each other's throats. We don't agree in this. So do you think politicians, especially at that top level, where we're talking MLAs, the people who are regularly on TV or on radio, that they need to modify the messaging or change the messaging, that it's too divisive? Because let's face it, most people don't consume news 24 hours a day, and they only pick up, Trevor and Anton have mentioned that division. Do you think people at the top of your party, the top of the UP, need to change the message?
I don't think we can be that general to say all need to change the message. I mean, there's definitely room for improvement. I believe that if you're being honest about moving this society forward, then we're all going to have to sort of take a bit of a braver step. I think the optics, and I agree with you, there's a lot of sort of behind the scenes work that happens that maybe doesn't make it onto the media, and it maybe should, and that would maybe help to bring your community in behind you. I think the politicians could be doing more in terms of being visual at events that are cross-community and very much leading the charge on that, because much as people might disagree with your message, there will be a slight change psychologically where they say, okay, well, if they're doing that, then maybe there is a rationale behind this, and they're more likely to fall in behind you to some extent. I think our other challenge is, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I think anyone involved in politics goes into a bubble and they genuinely believe that most of society are listening to their message, or they had an interest in the council committee that took place the week before. And I actually fell into that trap myself until I thought, Tina, catch yourself on. There, 9 times out of 10, people will not be logging into the council meeting or listening. They will see the headline figures in the Irish news. They're generally more likely to listen to negative news. So I think in terms of the media as well and politicians, I like to just try and put out positive messages all the time. And if there is a negative incident, it's not that you want to brush it under the carpet. It's just, there's no point in giving it loads of oxygen when you maybe have the likes of Anton's group and Davis Youth Project running a 6-week summer scheme for 100 young people a day. Give that airtime. You know, all right, we know that we'll have our issues with bonfires, but they are sporadic, they're one-off, and generally they can bring out the worst in people at interfaces. So focus on the positives, and I think there is an onus on politicians to be driving that message forward rather than feeding the beast of sectarianism.
When I come to you, Katie, in this, again, trying to be positive, quite difficult, but what has actually worked in terms of the Department of Justice's engagement with communities? Maybe not dramatic things like, bringing the Cooper Way peace wall down, but in terms of actually getting communities to interact with each other and at least discuss a future, what kind of things have actually worked or proved fruitful?
I think some of the things that have been mentioned already in terms of, I suppose, for us, recognising that it's not just about the physical structure and it is about the wider locality. So one of our starting points is always, what else is being planned in the area? What else is going on? What are the regeneration plans? What else is planned for the area? And that is really, really important because, as you say, people need to understand, well, what are the benefits for me? What's going to improve as a result of this scheme being taken forward? And, I'll give you a few examples. So up at Serpentine, really, really successful scheme that's been taken forward. The wall has been removed. There's a multi-use games area now that's being used by both sides of the community. It's a brilliant facility. It's really, really modern, and it gives people a reason to come together because there is a really good facility there. Now, that's not always going to be possible, so you also need to look for the smaller wins, as it were. Sometimes they're not things that we have planned. So you look at the Hillview development site. That a new Lidl has gone in, there's a Home Bargains going in. I know there's plans from the Housing Association, but it starts a conversation around the use of that space and the use of that place. And it starts a conversation about Flack Street and, providing access to the space for both sides of the community because there are reasons to go there and reasons to mix. And I thought, Anton, I think it was you that made the point around people will still have underlying concerns around safety, and we do need to address that. It's not enough simply to say, we'll take it down, I'm sure it'll be fine. And sometimes that means taking iterative steps. And so, for example, no one is at the moment, I think, talking about taking down Cooper Way, but replacing the gates, for example, from solid barriers to see-through gates with vehicular and pedestrian access means that, first of all, you're improving the visual amenities in the area. You're making it more, you're removing some of that, I think, securitized history or securitized kind of feel of those structures. You are creating better access. And then we would do things, and they sound like small things when you talk about them, but we would have worked with colleagues, in DFI to put in place a turning circle and some yellow lines. So the point that Tina made around safety is really, really important, actually. And I mean, not security safety, but environmental safety is actually important. So sometimes people don't use these access points because it doesn't feel safe to do so. But you put some yellow lines in, you improve access. And we've had really, really positive feedback for things like that. And even regularising or extending gate opening hours, for example, because it actually starts to, firstly, the very obvious thing that it improves access because the gates are open for longer, then you're more likely to use them because it's more convenient. It maybe coincides with your commute or your walk home, so you're more likely to be using them. But also, there's the gate at North House Street that last year opened on a Sunday, and I think it's the first time in 26 years that it's opened on a Sunday. There's been no incidents, no issues with that. So that in and of itself starts to build confidence that maybe what you were worried about in terms of having that access, maybe there isn't as much to worry about as you thought in the first instance, but it isn't taking that huge sort of leap necessarily that is going to be hard to move back from. But it's giving people that iterative kind of engagement and cross-community contact that then allows us to then move forward with maybe a more substantial scheme. So I think it's important that when we look at success and look at opportunities, we certainly don't just look at where can we take it down, where can we get our numbers down. You know, we went from 59 to 42 structures. Of course, that still sounds like a lot, but I would classify success and progress not just by the amount of structures that we have on a list, but actually where are we seeing progress across communities.
We've covered a heck of a lot of ground, actually, and we are approaching, I suppose, the final part of this discussion. So I want to move it forward, and Anton, I'm going to come to you first, because obviously you are the youngest in this panel. You work with young people. We're all agreed that the 2023 is not a target to bring peace walls down. I think from what I've learned from this discussion, I hope people watching have it, is that it's peace walls are only a part of a much wider issue. It's very complex in terms of regeneration, in terms of community relations, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of things for young people to do, and in terms of security. But going forward, the executive, as Katie said, are going to have to look again at T-Buck. They are going to have to come up with a new strategy for peace walls. Can you see any point where peace walls are not going to be part of your life or part of the life of the young people you work with? And if so, what would it take to do that? Or do you think even thinking that way isn't helpful?
Honestly, I would love to see them put down in my lifetime. Realistically, I would love the target of 2050, but you know, it's far away. But at the same time, it's about having that conversation. It's about having that discussion, and it's about all of us coming together, such as the likes of DOJ and T-Buck, and then the ones on the ground. It's about us coming together and addressing these wider issues. It's about taking our small wins, which is incredible to hear that. What, many 8 are down off the peace walls, Katie?
Down to 42 from 59,
So, we are winning. It's just highlighting them small wins, and it's just about progressing the young people and the wider community together. Realistically, I don't like to see my city segregated. If I want to go over to the likes of the Shankill and it's past 7:30, I have to go the whole way downtown and then cut around to go into it, where I'm only going over to visit friends. Now I have a load of friends across the city, and personally, I don't have any fear about going into any areas. Now, I know some people do, but it's just about starting that conversation. I'm a strong believer, if you start it with a conversation, you can grow it into anything.
But do you think it's helpful to talk about bringing peace walls down as a whole? Because what's interesting is, what's been talked about is that often it's about small changes. It's putting a gate in a peace wall, making that gate open for a bit longer. Those small developments are what works. Or is it better to have that big ambition of bringing it?
At the same time, it's a big tourist attraction as well. It is a
and that's something we haven't
attraction.
really talked about.
Big time. But at the same time, it's what do you leave behind? Do you leave like a reminder of what we did have, or what the city was like, or coming to it, it's about the wider issues. It's about the smaller stuff. One team can't fix this. It has to be a united front. But that said, it needs to be the conversations need to be flowing, because if they don't flow, then they'll just be until 2050, and then we'll be looking at another review to take them down again. So it is just about keeping that mindset there, having them conversations, regardless if they're repetitive, and just trying to get people more relaxed with the concept of it.
Trevor, is this something we should really look? Again, we've identified there are a lot of problems, especially for deprived communities in Belfast, that probably need sorted. So do we focus too much on peace walls, or actually should we have a real effort to engage communities by peace walls to talk about bringing them down? Where do you think the focus should lie?
I think the work within the landscape around the should be sorted out first, and then, and as Katie has said, and I totally agree, it's the small things. Start off with the small things. Open a small gate. As long as you know that both sides of that community have got an appetite for it, do it small. There's not I'll be totally honest, there's not a chance of Cooper Street wall coming down in the next, I would say, 10 years. I think anybody would be looking at anything like that, or it's a pipe dream. But Anton's also said about the fact that tourism, because it was going through my head since I thought about coming here. I says, we're going to be talking about peace walls and bringing them down. And every time you go up along Cooper Street, there's buses, black taxis, all making money out of them peace walls. Maybe at some stage we could be doing something, as already been said, with the peace walls and keeping them there, but in a different sort of way. That's way out of my sort of thing. That would be architectural stuff and stuff, maybe lowering a peace wall, just different wee things. But definitely it wouldn't be a thing about taking them down. But opening wee gates, opening parts of the walls, different times, sounds good. It seems to have worked in different places, like is it Alexandra Park? It opened for a bit. There was a couple in, I think it's Limestone Road. They had a few. It wasn't actually walls. It was security things on the blocking off streets. They took them away. They were small things, and it's the small things that can lead to something big. But at the minute, I'd say stick to the small, because you'll get further.
So do you think then, again, similar question I posed to Anton, when the executive will have to look at this again in the next couple of years, because obviously the 2023 target's not going to be met. Do you think then they should not be setting another target, that actually that the focus is wrong there?
If you set a target date, you're setting yourself up to fail, because in Northern Ireland you don't know what's around the corner, and when it comes to, I hate saying the word politics again, you just don't know. Everybody could be okay, and then all you have to do is look over the last 5 years. We've had Brexit, we've had 3 years of no stormont, we've had a national worldwide pandemic, we've had the REC border, and we've had instability in government. That's only in the last 5 years. And that's all coming in 5 years. So if you start putting dates for bringing down walls, I think you're just walking yourself into failure.
I think we'd all like to see a more boring next 5 years, actually, in various ways. I'm actually going to end with Katie, Tina, but from your point of view, similar. I mean, obviously your party and other politicians are probably going to be part of this conversation. Would you like to see a different focus in terms of a peace wall strategy when it does come up and have to be discussed again going forward? Would you like that blanket ambition to go, and timescale?
I agree with Trevor. Don't think putting time scales on it is useful. I think if you get a few sites that go well, like Distillery Street, and we're working with DOJ, with NI Water, and with the housing executive around looking at a sustainable urban drainage system there, and it's a really good environmental, very innovative scheme. If that goes well, I think the ripple effect can be seen across the city, where other sites will say, well, generally what happens in the city is they got one, I want one. So use that as a way forward. But Robbie, I think the big priority is more about deprivation. I think that the peace lines, interfaces, whatever, will become less relevant the more economically viable these communities come. And in terms of the dark tourism or political tourism, I know there's a big debate about that. If you keep sort of that element of the tourism industry, you're perpetuating the conflict. I don't agree with that. I think visitors to this city are discerning people who have an interest in the history of the city. I don't think there's any point in trying to mask the history of the city. I think that it should be shared. And visitors are intelligent enough to work out if what they're hearing is a certain narrative. They want to hear local narratives. They don't want to, hear an academic account. They want to hear local narratives. So I believe that we need to keep some elements of the peace lines there because people are interested in them. Trevor's right, you could maybe lower them, you can have different small steps, but I think the argument is less about the peace lines and more about the economy of this city and the fact that where interfaces are, generally there's poverty, and it's the poverty you need to break down before you'll ever get rid of the peace line.
I think what's come across totally in the discussion for me has been, say, all those interconnected things that work around peace lines that we've. This discussion was about breaking down the walls and peace walls, but we've actually talked about a lot of other things as well. And if I can finish with you, Kate, I mean, obviously, the overall strategy has to be for the executive, it has to be for politicians, but you work on this day in, day out. Obviously, the Department of Justice will be feeding in to whatever comes after the current 10-year strategy, if you like. What messages will you as a department be putting into those discussions? Is it that ultimately small, painstaking, in some cases, steps are more important than an overall vision? Or do you think that overall vision and the time scale is still important?
I think what we'll be feeding in is what we have been feeding in over the last number of years, because we would work very closely with our colleagues right across the executive and statutory bodies and the communities as well, which is that the ambition, I think, and I would talk about not the ambition just around peace walls and interface physical structures, but the TBUC ambition and the good relations ambition is one that we very much need to retain and enhance and let it evolve and develop, actually, because when we talk about good relations now and shared communities, we need to be very cognizant of the fact that yes, that means people living on either side of the interface, but it also needs to reflect that we have a much more diverse society now than we did have 10 years ago. And I think someone was talking earlier about, sort of working with new communities who have come in, and we need to make sure that our understanding and ambition around good relations is broad enough to encompass all of that, because actually that's really important as well, to start to, I suppose, move forward cross-community relationships as well. So I mean, I think I said earlier, my personal view is I'm yet to be convinced that a timescale on interface structures specifically is helpful. Having said that, I do think that any government strategy should be high level, it should be broad, and it should be ambitious. So our strategy going forward for good relations and for building united communities should continue to have those aspirations. The focus today of the conversation has been interfaces, but the focus of TBUC has always been about taking that in parallel with shared housing, shared education, urban villages, broader regeneration conversations. That has always been the way in which we approach it. But I think it's very easy to shift the narrative onto the interfaces because they are very obvious physical manifestations of a lot of the historic issues or how we've got to this point, and a reminder of our history, as you say, and I think the tourism discussion it's for someone else probably in the Department for Economy, but it's a very interesting point, and I think it's one that needs thought and discussion, and I would agree with Tina that there are lots of ways of thinking about how we reflect on the past as part of the story of the city, that doesn't necessarily need to retain solid structures that come with their own issues. So I suppose what we'll be feeding in, I suppose to try and summarise that, is yes, the ambition should remain by all means, but let's make sure that we're very clear on defining what success looks like, and success needs to have there needs to be a rounded view of success, which is about looking at what are we trying to achieve in that particular locality or that particular area, what's for the best for the community at that particular point in time. And that can sometimes mean the removal, and it does sometimes. We remove full structures, and we're always really pleased when we're able to do that. Quite a lot of the structures that we remove wouldn't, and we talked about, how many, some of the structures that we remove wouldn't actually count in terms of our figures as a removal because it's part of a structure, but that doesn't mean it's not going to make a big difference for that particular community. So just making sure that our definition of success is about what we're trying to achieve in a locality and what's for the best of that community. And that might be a smaller step, but keeping our eyes on the prize, I suppose, of what's the ambition for shared society in Northern Ireland more generally. And as part of that, removal of interface structures has to be part of that ambition. But there are steps to get there.
But can I ask you finally, does the messaging need to change going forward? Because from my point of view, I think when we hear, and I could be just talking as a cynical journalist here, but when we hear things like phrases like good relations, shared community, shared city, there's a lot of PR put out. And actually, there is a lot of good work that goes on the ground. We've heard it today. There's a lot of cross-community contact. We have newcomer communities coming in that, let's face it, don't really care, whether they're in a nationalist or a loyalist or Republican community, but they just want a good standard of living. And that's the case for a lot of people here as well. There's a lot of great youth projects. There's, youth and community workers working day in, day out with each other. Despite our segregated education system, as Anton's mentioned, there's a lot of contact between schools as well. There's a lot that goes on. And yet I feel, and I'm speaking personally here, in some ways, we have all talked about the realism of that work on the ground, the fact it's painstaking, it's problematic. In PR terms, often that doesn't get reflected. We just hear jargon about shared communities, shared good relations. Do you think that really helps? Do you think the messaging has to become more detailed perhaps and more realistic?
I think the messaging is more nuanced than that, but I think when you are elevating that to whether it's headlines or sound bites or press statements, it can be difficult to put across the nuance of the complexity of the work that is going on. And I think someone made a point earlier about highlighting the positive as well. And whilst we try to do that, I take your point that can come across perhaps as, PR or spin or jargon. So, I mean, certainly I think it's something we need to take on board. If that is how it is being reflected, outwardly, then I think that's something we need to take on board. And anytime you look at refreshing a strategy or looking at what comes next, you go out and you talk to people and you get feedback and you find out what worked and you find out what didn't work. You learn from that and you adapt. And I think that will need to be part of the process, taking on board what you've said and actually everything that we've talked about today.
Folks, that is all we've time for. We could actually probably talk on for at least another hour or two about this. It's been a hugely complex issue. I have learnt a lot. I hope that you who have watched this have learnt a lot as well. I'd just like to thank our panel, Anton, Trevor, Katie and Tina. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion it was meant to be about peace walls. I think we've addressed many other things. Thanks for watching. Obviously, there's loads of other fantastic events taking place in Féile and Phobail, West Belfast Festival. So hopefully you'll enjoy some of those too. Thanks again.